Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop AI and non-discrimination in digital spaces from prevention to redress. I'm just gonna read the session rules and then give the floor to Aisha. So please enter with your full name if you're online. To ask a question, raise the hand using the Zoom function. You will be unmuted when the floor is given to you. When speaking, switch on the video, state your name and affiliation. Do not share links to the Zoom meetings, not even with your colleagues. Thank you very much. Aisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sumaya. Good morning to everyone in Strasbourg, and good morning to those joining online. My name is Ayça Dibekoglu, and I work at the Hate Speech, Hate Crime, and Artificial Intelligence Unit of the Council of Europe, which is within the Anti-Discrimination Department of our organization, where among many areas of work, we focus on strengthening human rights and equality in the context of emerging technologies. I'm delighted this morning to be moderating this session together with my head of unit, Menno Ettema, which we bring together expert voices from across academia, civil society, tech community, and public institutions. Today, we're here to explore a critical and urgent question. How can we ensure that AI systems, which are now increasingly used in law enforcement, in welfare and employment, and in health, do not infringe or amplify discrimination and the right to equality? AI is often presented as neutral or objective, but in reality, it's shaped by data, it's shaped by assumptions and power structures that go deep within its design and its use. This session is called, as Sumaya mentioned, From Prevention to Redress, AI and Non-Discrimination in Digital Spaces, and the idea is to push beyond the surface. We'll explore what prevention, mitigation, and meaningful redress should actually look like in practice, and who gets to shape those outcomes. And you'll hear from a brilliant panel of experts, and we will be inviting you, the audience, among who are also experts who are actively working in this area, to actively contribute through interactive polls and questions that we will be presenting to you via Mentimeter. Please remember that this is a conversation, not just a panel. And after short interventions from each panelist, we'll move on to Mentimeter questions, and we hope that they will be as thought-provoking to you as they were to us. And after various answers, we'd like you to encourage you to further elaborate on your answers and explore topics that we haven't discussed to make it as effective and beneficial as possible. So let's dive in. I would like to first give the floor to Robin Aisha Pokorny, who is a computer scientist who specializes in algorithmic discrimination and bias. And you might also recognize Robin as the first person who established case law around algorithmic discrimination in the Netherlands after challenging a discriminatory facial recognition algorithm. Robin, drawing both from your personal experience and also your broader work that you're currently doing on fairness and bias, we'd love to hear on how you approach these challenges and possibilities of preventing, mitigating, and addressing algorithmic discrimination. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for the great introduction. Happy to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Aisha Pokorny, and I work on the intersection of data-driven technologies and the implications that it has on people, especially from a race, gender, and class income perspective. I work from the approaches that are anti-techno-solutionist, which means that complex social problems can not only be fixed by technology alone, and especially if these problems are made by the technology. That an example of this is data-driven facial detection software that cannot recognize people of a certain skin color. In order to fix that, it's not only a techno-solutionist perspective that can fix this problem. And from the approach of radical reform, or also known as non-reformist reform, which indicates that community gain is more important than individual gains. And we do this by optimizing community work and going to the communities that are being harmed instead of looking at it from an outside perspective, looking in, trying to fix problems that we're not personally or at least as a community related to. The three approaches for prevention of AI harms that I work with within my consultancy, so I advise different clients about this, is that community always goes above the technology, the community that's being harmed is the expert, and of the integration of diverse knowledge. This means that technological knowledge, such as computer science, data-driven knowledge on a higher education level, is more accepted than community-based expertise, so real lived experiences. And how we do this is already being done, is that small communities with all over the world, for example, in Singapore, there is a impact-driven community that does work around mitigation of AI harms by going directly from a prevention point of view. What they do is that they actually look at if the technological non-use, so looking at whether technology is needed or not, is actually the first question being asked instead of creating and developing these technologies. This doesn't mean that AI cannot help or support those in need. It just means that we look further back before deploying and implementing technologies that could potentially cause harm, and not have a mitigation as a reactive way, but a responsive way, but looking beforehand before deploying.
Thank you very much, Robin. So now I'd like to give the floor to Louise Hooper, a human rights barrister with over 20 years of experience focused on human rights, human dignity, and equality. Besides her consultancy work, Louise currently serves as an expert of the Council of Europe's Committee on Artificial Intelligence, Equality, and Non-discrimination, which is abbreviated as GEC-CDADI. Louise, drawing on your legal expertise and your work in international standard setting, how do you see the role of law and policy frameworks in shaping responses to algorithmic discrimination? The floor is yours.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is what AI systems are and do in terms of being models and systems that capture patterns from data in a model. And data comes from real-world processes, which means humans, and humans are inherently flawed beings. We are discriminatory by nature, and data that we get from our historical processes is very often dirty in terms of we're not all consistent about the way that we collect or input data into models or systems. At the moment, we, by which I mean generally older white men with political or economic power, are more and more reluctant to accept discrimination is bad or take steps to ensure equality exists in society. And you can see this in things like, for example, aggressive attempts to dismantle equality, diversity, and inclusion programs. So all of this feeds into how we regulate, what we're regulating, and the social approach to law. And against this background, algorithmic discrimination itself is difficult to detect. So who's being discriminated against? Was it a mistake? Was it by design? It's difficult to prove. We can't access data. We don't understand the systems. We have black boxes with nobody understanding what algorithms are doing. We don't know how decisions are made, what influences them. And overarching all of this, access to justice is costly, it's time-consuming, and it can be very difficult for individual victims. In the context of AI and and ADM, the opacity of systems, information, and power asymmetry between the deployer and subject, the lack of capacity to monitor group effects or to compare yourself to another person, the inability to access this information, and an absence of transparent, meaningful information can preclude proper assessment of discrimination or prevent legal action from being started. And it's there where I think regulation comes in. We have two attempts that I'd like to just touch on. One is the Council of Europe Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence, Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law. And the other is the EU AI Act. Primarily under the Charter, the Framework Convention, this is directed to and governs state actions, not the actions of companies. It places the responsibility on states to regulate, to govern providers and deployers of AI. It solely focuses on human rights, rule of law and democracy rather than other issues, and it's not yet in force. Article 10 is the key provision in respect of equality and non-discrimination, which includes not just a negative obligation, but also, interestingly, a positive obligation for AI to be used to overcome inequality, which we may talk about in terms of techno-solutionism later on. It also has a whole series of effective procedural guarantees, safeguards and rights designed to enable people to litigate if necessary. and requires effective oversight mechanisms. The EU AI Act, by contrast, is directed to and governs states, but also providers and deployers of AI. So it's directly relevant to providers and deployers and can be directly relied on by individuals to protect and enforce their rights. It's built on product safety principles rather than a human rights-based approach. There are some criticisms of the approach in determining what AI is risky before you determine what AI is risky, which I find quite complicated. And then it sets out a series of requirements for both providers and deployers to comply with. When read with some of the new European legislation on equality bodies, there are some really significant new powers for authorities responsible for protecting fundamental rights, and they're at Article 77 and in the new directives on equality bodies. And for time reasons, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Louise. And lastly, our final panelist is joining us online. Hi, good morning, Mary. I see you online. I would like to now give the floor to you, Mary Hakopian, Amnesty International's Advocacy Advisor on EU AI regulation. Mary leads the advocacy work at the Algorithmic Accountability Lab of Amnesty Tech and brings experience from the European Disability Forum, Equinet, and the Council of Europe. Mary, drawing from your advocacy work in the Algorithmic Accountability Lab and across these institutions, how can we build truly meaningful multi-stakeholder participation in shaping AI policy? And what does it look like in practice when it comes to tackling discrimination? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. As I mentioned in the coordination meeting we had last week, I started my professional journey at the Council of Europe in Armenia, so always happy to be back. So thank you for the invitation. I will dive right into the question, just maybe also a bit presenting the team that I'm in currently, which is one of the Amnesty International's tech and human rights program teams called the Algorithmic Accountability Lab. And the way we do our work, I think, is really fitting to the question that you asked, because we're a multidisciplinary team that covers under the broad umbrella of the automated state. We do our work basically focusing on the AI use in the public sector, so by public authorities in the areas of like social protection, policing, migration, border surveillance, military use of AI, etc. And where, of course, when there's public and private partnerships involved, we look at that as well. But mainly our focus is the use by public authorities. The way we do approach our work in terms of both research, advocacy, litigation work, media and communications work is focusing on collaborating with impacted communities, with other civil society organizations and networks based in Brussels that represent different community organizations. So a lot of membership organizations that have members in different EU states, focusing on migration, focusing on disability rights, focusing on LGBTI rights. So it's different networks. We try to connect to the membership on the ground. This is when we do advocacy, but in terms of research, when we do research in specific countries, such as in Serbia, in Denmark, also supported investigations in Sweden, in the Netherlands, these processes are always with collaboration with local organizations that represent different communities that are impacted by AI systems. For example, a research we did in Denmark that you might know about, which looked at the welfare protection scheme use of a fraud detection algorithm that heavily discriminated and surveilled migrant communities, people with disabilities. We worked with disability rights organizations, with organizations that work on racial justice, on representing migrant communities. So I think this is really important in terms of also making sure that communities are equipped and are the ones leading the work to challenge a lot of the harms that these systems pose. Similarly, in litigation work, for example, in France, we are engaged in an initiative that is led by local or civil society, digital and human rights organizations, challenging the Social Security Agency's National Family Allowance Fund use of fraud detection algorithm, which is also allegedly discriminatory. So there's a court case filing that has called for the system to be stopped. So I think this collaborative approach with organizations that represent directly communities is very important. I think maybe when we also talk about redress and remedy measures, we need to also be mindful that we are not talking about it in an isolated manner, but we think of the system, the ecosystem that is around AI, starting from the conceptualization to the development to deployment. And in that sense, I think to ensure effective redress and remedy, we need to also ensure that the transparency and the public accountability measures are set in place. And even going back, I think what Robin said really resonates with me as well, is that sometimes we need to also think if a certain type of AI system is actually necessary, and if it's the appropriate solution in the context, then we need to draw clear red lines on things that shouldn't be deployed. So I think in some sense, a ban could be the prevention in itself and the appropriate mitigation measure. So we don't need to wait until the harm occurs and then think about now what is the redress and remedy process to mitigate that. I think I will stop here, but really looking forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, at some point your screen got a bit smaller in our screens. Thank you to each of you for your interventions and powerful insights. And now it's time to hear from the audience, from you. I'd like to hand over to Menno, who will guide us through a short series of Mentimeter questions. If you have your phones out, you can scan the QR code or enter the code on Menti.
Great. It always takes a moment before the screen comes up. Yes, to open the eyes, we want to launch a little Menti. You can have a look at the, you can type in on your phone or laptop the URL code menti.com, and you have the entry code. You'll see that code on every screen that's coming up. Or if you can take a moment to use your phone to scan the QR code so you can enter. Don't close the tab after the screen goes, because we will use the Mentimeter the rest of the session. So then I go forward to the first question, just to go back to a point that was made by a few. The question we want to ask is, can you solve inequality with AI? Yes, it's technically possible. Yes, it's a good way to address inequality. No, it's technically not possible. Or no, we must solve inequality differently. So what are your thoughts on this? I'll give you a few minutes or a few seconds to complete. I see that there's 52 people registered. That's lovely. We're seeing the answers coming in. So I'll give 2 more seconds. Okay. So what we're seeing at the moment is that a large part believes that AI cannot solve inequality and it must be solved differently. There are also those who think that it's a good way to address inequality. Technically not possible is the least of a concern. Some 9 people mentioned that technically it's possible. So, but the largest part, nearly half, say that we cannot solve inequality through AI. Connected to that, we have a next question. What's the main barriers to effective AI regulation for tackling discrimination and bias? So what are the main barriers to effective AI regulation for tackling discrimination and bias? We got a few answers, and you can how do you call it? Rank, thank you, Aitja. Rank the various answers. You can also skip. So if you think one is the major issue, then you put that as first, and then the second or third reasons, because they could all be relevant, but you can also skip if you don't think they are of a concern to the effectiveness of AI regulation to tackle discrimination and bias. Okay, this takes a little bit longer because you have to rank and move the things. Okay. Feel free to still answer, but I'll just try to summarize a little bit what we're seeing is that the responses are that some of it's equal that no one agrees what discrimination is, so that's a barrier to effective AI regulation, and it's also already too little and too late, which is an interesting response, and maybe that invites us for some discussion. Also, there's quite a strong response, assumption that AI is the answer. So the question is if this is indeed the case. There's some finger pointing to big tech, and then there's also some remarks about that it has to be global to be effective. Okay, I'll just pinch in one more question. Referring a bit to the first speaker, do current approaches to AI take group-based discrimination seriously? So this is a yes, no, maybe question, so that goes a bit quicker. Now, you can still vote, but I see a tendency towards no. Current approaches to AI do not take group-based discrimination seriously. I think this is another some maybe. So I think this is an interesting reflection point as well. There are a few more questions, but maybe we stop here and give the floor back to you, Aitja, for some reflections from the audience.
Thank you, Menno. So we have more questions, as Menno mentioned, but we'll take it in a step-by-step approach to have discussions in the middle before finishing all of the questions. And thank you for all your responses. It's clear that there's quite a lot of insight and experience in the room. I'm also quite surprised at some of the answers as well, and I'd like to further discuss. And let's now open the floor for a broader discussion. We'd like to invite you and our panelists to respond, whether that's building on what we have answered in the questions or picking up on something that hasn't yet been fully explored. And please feel free to raise a hand to ask a question and also comment on the chat. And let's use this time to dig in deeper. I'd like to actually first ask whether Equinet has any input on this. Here on the panel, we have Mila Vidina. Mila leads Equinet's work on AI and algorithmic discrimination. I think the first three questions specifically relate quite heavily to inequality and some thought-provoking questions on this. So I'd be curious to hear your insights on this, Mila. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. So for those of you who wonder what Equinet stands for, it's not equestrian and horses. It's a network of national equality public authorities. And our network seeks to empower and bring the collective voices of 47 such institutions across Europe from 35 European states. So equality bodies are anchored in EU law, national law as well, but we go broader than that. So all Council of Europe member states, to my knowledge, have equality bodies. So why are we here? Equinet has been working on non-discrimination for 6 years. And your first question, can AI solve inequality, is something that we were trying to tackle head on, like as in literally working with technical and with software engineers and data scientists for the past year and a half in the context of technical standardization. Maybe you heard that the A Act, the European Union A Act, rests upon compliance would be based upon conformity with a set of technical requirements. Those technical requirements are embodied through technical standards. Those are the same standards that you have for a light bulb or for a toy. And then you have that CE, safe use marking, that you see across Europe. Well, this is how the high-risk AI system under the A Act would be certified as safe. Now, the problem is that part of the A Act, especially Annex 3 to the A Act, includes human rights. I deliberately want to use this, like with human rights critical AI systems. So how would engineers know how to evaluate a risk to a human right? And how do they certify as being safe? And mind you, they self-certify. This makes it even more problematic. So what we as Equinet have been trying to do is answer this question, okay, can AI solve inequality if we engage with industry at this technical standardization fora, which is extremely resource intensive, unrepresentative of our society, and with a high entry barrier in terms of how much time we had to invest. We got a small pot of public money from the UK, not even the European Union. And we were dealing with the EU legislation that only lasted for a year and a half, and most of us for now are working pro bono. But in that project, basically, we worked with industry representatives, most of them data scientists, software engineers, and cybersecurity specialists, to see whether in those technical standards, it's a set of standards, around 10, we could embed equality safeguards. Can you solve the inequality question? For example, how do you select a fairness measure or a debiasing method that could more effectively tackle potential inequality aspects? Or if you have to assess risks, when you design and develop a system. So most of this is about design and development. Some of this is deployment, but according to the A Act, even the deployment kind of preparation is done prior to release on the market. So most of the conversation is what we anticipate, what we foresee as risks to equality. How can you foresee ex ante all risks to equality? And could an engineer make this assessment? So we've been trying to see how to set up the human oversight mechanism. So each technical organization that has to certify a system, they have a designated person to assess those risks to human rights. Do they have the necessary competence? Do they have interdisciplinary teams? How do you include affected communities in that? What is a way, because we talked about participation and it's all fine, but when you talk to engineers, where do you actually make it mandatory for them to include people? Well, there is a concept of design engineering with software specialists, and there is a consultation. There are the entry points purely within the technical community. And then when you want to validate a product, as a condition for validation, include stakeholder input. In the product safety branch, there are such things as testing products and consulting with consumers. Only now we are not talking about consumers, we are talking about affected persons. So long story short, based on that experience, as expected, AI cannot solve equality. What it could have, this is why we want to hopefully find also the means, the support financially to continue to be engaged with technical standardization. It could do minimal prevention. So there's some things that some technically feasible measures which you could implement at design and development that could give you documentation, logging, more transparency. You cannot completely resolve transparency and explainability. It's a contested concept within the engineering community, but more transparency. So basically you're getting leverage and information to contest and to enforce afterwards. So this is as a minimum, we hope, and maybe some prevention mitigation, insofar as you want the the developers, when they have a documentation, to be able to say, okay, why did I use this fairness metrics and not that fairness metric? And how was the fairness metric appropriate to the outcome, right? So you want that reason giving and justification, and also tracing decision-making in the way a product is developed. So this is important for accountability, right? At what point, who took the decision to use that over that? Who was overseeing the human, the human oversight mechanism? Who signed off product validation? Those things. And so in that way, it could give us some leverage, but ultimately it's costly and time-consuming policy changes and legal changes that would get us there. And I would end with an example. We were discussing recruitment algorithms, and there is there is literature, there is some evidence that human bias in recruitment is worse, whatever that means, than computer bias, right? So you could argue that there is more neutrality. Further to that, you can also tinker with the fairness metrics so that you actually use the algorithm to implement a kind of positive action. So it chooses preferentially, let's say, more women. But then the question becomes, who comes to that recruitment place? Who shows up for that particular position? Even if we have women, would it be the single mothers from immigrant background? So in this question of broader access and participation, the structural and systemic dimensions is something that I think could only be addressed through costly and slow, as I said, policy and legal processes. And I do not believe, just to link to another, I don't think that we necessarily have a problem with group-based discrimination, but we have a problem with the systemic and societal dimension. Because from our experience with technical standardization, and you could see this in the ACT, in the annex that outlines the technical documentation that all companies that have to prove compliance with the Act have to do. There you have group. They specifically mentioned that you have to provide data on impact, on anticipated impact on persons and groups. So groups are okay, but that broader systemic effect is really what we are fighting for. And I'll stop. It was a very long intervention. Sorry, lots of material accumulated over the years.
Thank you so much, Mila. Any questions from the audience? Yes, please go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. I would like the speakers to elaborate a little bit more on intersection.
I'm very sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you because I forgot to mention. Could you briefly say who you are as well before you ask your question? Thanks.
Of course. Hi, I am Linda Ardengue. I'm a trainee here at the Council. And yes, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask the speakers to elaborate a little more on the concept of intersectional discrimination, in particular if they think that from a technical and legal perspective, this issue can be addressed, because while intersectional discrimination by AI is being named in most of the documents concerning discrimination by AI and issues of accountability for algorithmic discrimination, it is not really addressed in that. It is, from what I noticed in my personal research, it is always named, but never really focused on. So if you could elaborate more on this, thank you.
Other questions? Any questions online, perhaps? No? Okay. Is there any one of you that would like to take up the floor first?
I think that finger was pointed at me. So I think intersectional discrimination is incredibly complicated. I think it's not dealt with properly in law. There's a lot of resistance in states to introduce legal prohibitions on intersectional discrimination before we even get to any problems in terms of detection and resolving intersectional discrimination in AI. So you start with, we don't understand most people don't properly understand what intersectional discrimination is. There's great reluctance at the Court of Justice of the European Union to deal with it. There is an increasing recognition in the ECHR and Council of Europe documents about intersectional discrimination. It's looked at in the context of the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women, for example. So that's my starting point. I think the second point on that is that it becomes very difficult to quantify, and one of the big issues with AI and tech-based both solutions and problems is the focus on data and what you can prove and what you can't prove. And I think starting from the perspective that statisticians know you can prove anything you like, depending on how you look at the data, you then have even bigger problems looking at something like intersectional discrimination. And I just want, within that context, want to touch on the difference between, on the way that I think about group-based and individual discrimination and why it's difficult, and I understand very difficult, to be able to produce a system that is fair for both individuals and for groups. And that's because of the way that data is analysed within a system. You can have something that's producing the right decision on the evidence that it has, but that ultimately produces a right decision that has very significant consequential impacts on groups and group discrimination. And my understanding is that you can basically, when you look at your metrics, you can code for 2 out of 3, but not for all 3 at the same time. So you end up either having individual discrimination or having group-based discrimination, some of which may be unlawful group-based discrimination and some of which may not be. So I think that also feeds into issues around intersectional discrimination.
Thank you very much, Louise. Would any of the panelists would like to respond, or would you like to? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I also think it's important to note that intersectional discrimination, as it's defined right now, is not seen as a root, like the root cause of discrimination outside of the technical sphere is not considered. It's seen as an add-on, so, and not a bug that immediately needs fixing. So when we look at the development of, I as well develop AI, I develop algorithms. So not only do I have the community-based perspective of people that are impacted by it, but I also make them. And within our pipeline, we do not consider any intersectional discrimination or any types of human-based discrimination within an integral part of mitigation within the development pipeline. What is considered, for example, is privacy or data set gaps. That's stuff that you consider from the get-go. How do you clean your data? How do you use it? How do you, which type of model are you going to use and how are you going to validate it? That's all based on technical model efficiency rather than the eventual or potential harm it could have on people. And that's why intersectional discrimination is always in the literature that you've read is oftentimes cited as an add-on or something after the fact. And I think that's important to recognize and acknowledge, because if we don't focus on that as an integral part of the development process, and even take a step back and look at what are the people who where this algorithm is going to be deployed, what do they have to say about it, and what alternatives are possible. Until then, it cannot be fixed. So AI cannot, in my opinion, cannot fix inequality because it is inherently made by the inequalities that are already existing. So it cannot fix what it is based on.
Thank you very much, Robin. I would like to give the floor back to Menno to present our next set of questions.
Thank you. We go back online. Yes, there you go. For those who closed their browser, you can see on the top still the hyperlink and the code that you need to use. So we go to the next question, which goes, most AI regulation focuses on harms after they happen. What would real prevention of discrimination look like in practice? This is again a ranking system, so you could put those that you think are most important on top, and then the rest order. And you can also skip if things you think are not relevant. I see 2 responses came in, and there we go. So mandatory impact assessment is an answer involving impacted communities in design, assessing whether AI is needed at all, stronger powers for equality bodies, or other measures. And I'm particularly curious, or we are particularly curious, what other measures you think could be taken. (21, 23 responses). Okay, I see still a few people responding, but it's quite evenly split. So there's a few answers that are popping up, but quite equally, assessing whether AI is needed at all, which I think the panelists also spoke about a few minutes ago. Stronger powers for equality bodies. I think this is, for Mila, a good response. Others, which I'm very curious about what they mean. And then the least amount of responses involving impacted communities in design and mandatory impact assessments. And maybe that's also worthwhile to reflect further on what these are actually and what this looks like among the panelists. Okay, so others is the biggest, so curious what that is, and assessing whether AI is needed at all, and equality bodies are the biggest responses. We have one more question, so I remember correctly. No, sorry, two more. What are the main barriers to effective enforcing regulation? The panel already addressed on a few concerns or few things that are really needed. But what do you think? Lack of transparency, is that a barrier? Explainability, access to data and training sets, commercial secrecy, or money and funding. What are the main barriers to effectively enforcing regulation? Okay, so here we see a trend of quite equally. So there are equal concerns when it comes to lack of transparency, access to data and training sets, money and funding. Money and funding for who, I might want to ask. Commercial secrecy and explainability is also mentioned. So they're all quite equally raised as barriers to effective enforcing regulation. We go to the next question, and this is an open question. So when we had other, I was curious what you had in mind. So this is an open question. How would you reduce AI-driven discrimination? What are your thoughts, insights, ideas? I invite you to keep it short. Don't write an essay, but maybe have some bullet point thoughts on what could be done that we could further discuss in the remaining of the session. So we get the first responses: proper use cases, reduce societal discrimination, human rights impact assessments, big tech transparency reporting on detecting biases and improvements, equality bodies and multi-community mandates, in the designing process, mechanisms of effective accountability, ensuring that companies have a skin in the game, non-discrimination by design, extra control, more equal society that is informed, empathy and using of the tool, literacy and using of the tool, integration of all steps in AI elaboration, checking and control, organizational accountability. I challenge the ideas that solutions lie in AI, feedback, accountability, mandatory impact assessments, consulting during the design, more funding to support consultation processes, proof of data sets, including affected communities, and taking their viewpoints into account, impact assessments, collect diverse and equality data, inclusive data sets, community participation in design. So these are some of the responses that are coming in. Human rights-based algorithmic design, etc. I leave this a little bit open, but I want to give the floor back to Aitja to ask to continue the process.
Thank you, Menno. I would like to ask, we have received quite a lot of responses to the word cloud. If you'd like to explain further your answers and bring any points that you mentioned. Okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Somaya. I'm with EuroDIG. Should I speak louder? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
So my name is Somaya. I'm with EuroDIG. If I can participate in the discussion, I think that we have to solve the problem of discrimination in the real life. Then we can solve it on the AI. As she explained, the expert explained, she wrote codes, and we cannot write good codes and fair codes and algorithms if the discrimination is already happening in the real life. For example, for recruitment, as you said before, there is a lot of discrimination when in the process of recruitment. So how can we write a good code that is not discriminating against the communities or a group of people or a class? So I think we should work in real life so then we can assess this on the codes and algorithms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumaya. I would also like to ask Meher if he would like to intervene at this point to further explore and respond to any of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I wanted to answer the last question we had on intersectionality, but I failed to find my raise the hand function in time. If it's okay, I can just maybe go back to that question.
Of course, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say that in terms of like our work, it's been important to also try to expand the way we look at things and the harms that AI can cause, because I think there is a lot of research and knowledge accumulated when it comes to, for example, racial discrimination and gender-based discrimination, but we often lack like knowledge about the discrimination that impacts, for example, based on disability, on socioeconomic ground, etc. And we at the lab, we've tried to kind of push those boundaries for ourselves, and some of the research in the past years that we've done. We've also tried to speak to communities, you know, that are like disability rights communities or Roma communities. So I think sometimes it's intuitive for researchers, for example, to just go based off the knowledge that exists, and we can often reinforce and advance the knowledge that is there, but we cannot know what we don't know, right? So I think sometimes we need to maybe even if we don't see examples out there in the media or you know already documented, we need to maybe push some of the boundaries of our thinking towards expanding how we see discrimination, and that can then help also address the gaps that we have in intersectional discrimination. And in the aspect of addressing it through advocacy, I think it's also been quite challenging for us to engage with a broader range of rights holders, because oftentimes organizations that represent different communities, they have so many urgent already issues that their communities are facing. So sometimes when we speak of AI, they don't necessarily see the direct connection that technology could have on the different rights that are being violated. For example, again, with disability rights, people face, for example, accessibility barriers, or there's a huge issue with institutionalization of people with disabilities. So to engage with the disability rights networks has been also kind of sometimes not they're not fully engaged in advocacy because they have issues that are, you know, for them like much more urgent at this point. But also there is the issue of people feeling intimidated by the conversations around AI, and I think we need to do a lot of work to demystify also how we speak about AI. I think Robin also mentioned about the the expertise, like who is considered to be an expert. We often in this kind of fora, we give priority to people who have technical expertise and a lot of professionalized kind of expertise, so to say, but we don't think of a person that has the lived experience as an expert. And I think these are limitations that we need to address to be able to actually go broader and address intersectional discrimination more effectively.
Thank you, Mary. If there's, are there any questions from the audience? If not, I'd like to actually pose 2 further questions myself to the panel. My first question actually is to Robin, because it relates to some of the points of your intervention. We had a question on do current approaches to AI take group-based discrimination seriously, and we thought we discovered the idea of involving impacted communities in the design of the process. But I wanted to ask, how do we secure the meaningful involvement of these communities? I think it's easier said than done. How does it truly work in practice?
That's actually a really good question, because it's already being done. There are communities who are currently who have created working groups to educate and inform larger regulatory bodies of who gets to decide what gets to be developed, deployed, and implemented. 2 good examples of this is the Distributed AI Research Research Institution, sorry. They combine community-based work with evidence-based technological expertise, but it's always from a community-based expertise perspective. What that means is that usually a large regulatory body will go out and collaborate with communities, but the end decision stays with the larger regulatory body. And in this case, they ensure that the community-based entities are actually the end-based decision makers. And another good example is a Canadian initiative called the Indigenous Protocol and AI Working Group. These are Indigenous people who actually create the regulatory, what we would call regulatory information from a Indigenous perspective, as they are currently the group of people being harmed by AI the most. And I think it bears mentioning that this is a very unpopular perspective still, even within a very large regulatory body building as we are today even. It's a very unrepresented perspective because, like we said before, has been mentioned many times before today, expertise is seen as a professional thing. You have to have some sort of technical education, higher education, but a lived experience needs to be seen as an expert experience and an expert seat to have at the table.
Thank you, Robin. Another question of mine is to both Louise and Mare, actually, because you have also touched upon this about meaningful collaboration and multi-stakeholder cooperation in the process. And I'd like to ask about, with regards to how you would reduce AI-driven discrimination, because this is also one of the answers that stood out on the Mentimeter, about the role of equality bodies and other regulators. How do we create a meaningful cooperation to make a real difference, and how do we engage the equality bodies and other regulators in the structural design?
Okay, I will address that, but I just want to add to what Robin said, because one of the problems with having got community participation, apart from the fact that there's no money to do it, but once you've got community participation, even when you prove something is causing discriminatory effect, quite often you don't get an adequate solution by a court or regulator. So what we saw in Canada with there was a similar issue to the sentencing case in the US, where Indigenous people in Canada are discriminated against by an algorithm in sentencing decisions. And the response of the court was, we accept that the discrimination is there, but it's all right because the judge knows that and will make a different decision. It's just not enough. It's not acceptable. It doesn't work. So don't give false promises to communities if you're asking them to become involved in anti-discrimination work by taking on board their expertise and then ignoring it afterwards because it's not okay. So that's the first thing that I would say about community type participation. In terms of equality bodies, again, adequate funding is needed. Within the context of the EU, I think there's a real need to give proper and adequate recognition as regulatory bodies in the context of the AI Act. Sorry, I'm forgetting your question. How much further do you want me to go? I got carried away with being cross about community participation not being taken seriously enough.
As you wish. About more of the role of other regulators, specifically the equality bodies, I'm curious about, because in fact I'd also like to hear Mila's intervention on this as well, because you have also worked with us on our project with now that we're running with 3 countries, and we specifically work with equality bodies in the EU sphere. So
thanks. So what we're doing with equality bodies, or what the Council of Europe's doing with equality bodies and have asked me to help with, is work on developing e-learning courses and online-offline courses to facilitate knowledge and awareness, and for that to then be rolled out to help equality bodies help other government institutions be aware of AI and equality issues, particularly when commissioning and using AI products. There's also issues to do with the way in which equality bodies can raise awareness of AI and discrimination, the tools that are available to them to investigate on behalf of both individuals and groups, and their ability to bring proceedings. And all of those things collectively as a package can really assist in terms of both using powers that individuals don't have to get access to documentation, information, and to test systems, to use regulatory sandboxes, and then to also bring proceedings if necessary.
thank you very much. Mila, would you also like to intervene briefly? Thank you.
I don't know where to start. I mean, well, maybe let's start with the obvious points. Equality bodies do not exist for the sake of equality bodies. It's a very technocratic language. Equality bodies. It's an access to justice mechanism. That's the way public access to justice mechanism. So what would set apart an equality body from an ombuds institution or a human rights center or human rights institute? In most of the cases, what sets them apart is all equality bodies handle cases directly. And most equality bodies work with both private and public sector. So being on the front line, handling cases, so being in that way an immediate, they also, some of our members decide on cases with legally binding decisions. The majority of our members have litigation powers. Not all of our members, but many have investigation powers. So for those reasons, because of the specificity of those powers, we think of them as an access to justice mechanism. So now, that said, what do we need to facilitate that access to justice, to make it actually more accessible and more effective? Because those are right. Accessibility barriers and effectiveness. Well, the funding was already mentioned. Funding also for the sake of potentially some of our members, for example, give fund. They do leave the decision-making power with whoever brings the complaint, and they fund and give free legal advice so that the party goes and litigates a case. So in this way, they do not influence, but I empower somebody to bring a case. But beyond funding, 2 points I wanted to make. Second is, one is equality bodies operate in an ecosystem, and equality law is only one part of the puzzle. We also have data protection law, we also have consumer protection law, we also have competition law if you're talking about big tech, and all of those have a stake in algorithmic discrimination. And equality bodies, we cannot, I've noticed for our staff members, we've been encouraging them to educate them on data protection law, and I know, for example, the French Defender of Rights works with their data protection authority, but not only, also in the Netherlands at the Dutch Institute. So what states could do is setting up, formalizing, institutionalizing a platform where all those regulators sit together And there is a kind of cross-pollination of the different types of expertise because they do not talk to each other. And equality law alone can only do that much because we do not, let's be honest, we do not have the sanctions the data protection law has. We do not have the enforcement powers or like, for example, even competition law, right? So we need to work together. Then we need reform in the law, but this was already made so that equality bodies are given more power. But outside of equality bodies, also burden of proof, like, and this is something that I know the scholar Rafaelis Senidis has worked on, that basically a presumption of algorithmic, so that you to make it easier to establish prima facie discrimination, shift the burden of proof whenever there is an algorithmic system deployed. Changing the sanctions under non-discrimination law, and perhaps equally importantly, moving away from a grounds-based approach, so having to prove you discriminate only on gender, only on disability, or combined gender and disability, but that you have to prove that each one of them there was a discrimination, and moving beyond that to a truly intersectional approach. In some legislation, like in Belgium, intersectionality is in non-discrimination law. There is a new directive, the Pay Transparency Directive of the European Union, where intersectionality is in the operative part of the directive. So it's a legal concept already with binding effects. In the Equality Bodies Directives, intersectionality is explicitly mentioned in the prevention and promotion powers. So member states have obligation to also, when they give prevention and when they enhance, not give, the prevention and promotion powers of equality bodies, to also consider intersectionality. So we're starting to have the tools, but we need this more also to empower our members. And one last thing, setting up a facility. I'm always, because we were exposed to it, I'm inspired by friends, and to my knowledge, it's the only public facility that provides that intergovernmental service of investigating algorithms and testing algorithms. I think it's called PEREN. I don't know how, I see a colleague, I don't know how to translate it, but the point is, if each government could set up a public facility that assists all regulators, equality bodies included, if you ask me, not only all regulators, academics and civil society as well, to actually do the technical testing and the technical investigation part, because we should not have the expertise, or should not be expected to have technical expertise, right? Our added value, unique added value, comes from, either it's lived experience or it's also human rights, legal and policy knowledge. But if states set up such a facility for us, I think this would allow a more coordinated, consistent, and also larger scale impactful approach. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Mila. Sorry, somebody's alarm went off in the room, which I think signaled that our session is over. I would just like to take one moment to see if Mayor would like to answer to my final question, a very brief answer, and then we would like to wrap up with sharing the messages from this session.
Thank you. Sorry, it takes a few seconds to unmute. Thanks for that. I will be very short. I would just like to say that equality bodies, and not only also the NHRIs, the DPAs, the European data protection supervisors, their support in the AI Act process has been greatly appreciated by civil society organizations, because I think they add to the kind of the legitimacy of the calls that we often make. I think we live in a world where sadly sometimes civil society is seen to be a bit too radical or ambitious, and when we have public bodies supporting, very strong, making very strong kind of also calls that we make in terms of bans, in terms of sufficient human rights safeguards, I think it really adds to the effectiveness of the work that we do. So yeah, it's just like an opportunity to thank Equinet and all the other organizations that work with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. I would just like to share the last Mentimeter question, which will be running while we get the message from this session, because we are curious what you might want to take forward after this session. So for us, this is a kind of a feedback, and see if we inspired you to take action. So we'll leave this open, and I give the floor to my colleague for the message from the session.
Okay, good morning. I'm just going to try to share my screen on Zoom.
Yeah, so I'll stop sharing, but the Mentimeter stays open, so you can fill in your answers while the screen is shared.
Okay, here we go. And this is what I could capture from the session. It was really rich, but we can only have three main takeaways that I will read. And we expect a general consensus. So it's more about the message than about the specific content or the way that it's built in that we can still work out afterwards. We still have 1 or 2 weeks that we can give it some tweaks. So the first message would be, I decided to divide it into 3 parts: prevention, mitigation, and redress. On prevention, we have that the session agreed that more needs to be done to address group-based discrimination and inequality, and it may not be solved with AI alone. It may be necessary to assess if AI is really needed or if non-technical solutions may be more effective. Where AI is needed, transparency and accountability is crucial. Bias detection with mandatory impact assessments must be used, as well involving and consulting impacted communities in the AI design and development processes, combined with stronger powers for equality bodies and industry best practices. Does it make sense? Okay, so the second one would be mitigation. Algorithm discrimination is difficult to detect and to prove, and those affected find it difficult to access justice. When it comes to intersectional discrimination, it is even more difficult, not only because of the resistance of states and international courts to deal with them, but also to effectively work with affected communities. There are main barriers to effective AI regulation for tackling discrimination and bias. And session participants agreed that those include the lack of transparency and accountability, access to data and training sets, as well commercial secrecy and funding. And finally, redress. Access to adequate funding, particularly to equality bodies, is a main barrier to access justice. Some steps are being taken by advocacy groups to collaborate with regulatory bodies, but a multi-stakeholder approach at a global level involving civil society, private sector, equality bodies and communities is vital for meaningful cooperation and to fully address discrimination in all its forms, particularly intersectional discrimination. Is everyone okay with that? Is anyone would like to include something that is important that is not mentioned?
Please object now or until the 25th of May, until when we can finalize our messages. Okay,
Yeah.
I see no objections.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minda. Sorry that we're quite over time. Thank you for your time, for both of our panelists and the audience for being here and joining this discussion. I think we have a break now, so I hope to talk more to you soon then, and have a great rest of your conference.